and welcome to Lambda U. My name is Carol Cuello and I am a Liker Solutions and Support Scientist. Today, we're going to talk about the basics of Western blotting. Western blots are actually one of the most widely used techniques not only in biology labs, but also in chemistry labs. And in my case, it was the very first technique I ever learned. I still remember how excited I was to pour my own gels and hope to polymerize and all that cool stuff. It's actually really fascinating to think about how creative and resourceful scientists can be in designing experiments that allow us to better understand the world around us. Well, in the case of Western blots, Western blot is a technique that allows us to analyze the protein content of any biological sample. And not only that, but it allows us to really target that one specific protein of interest in the midst of a complex series of proteins. Before Western blots were around, in 1975, a scientist called Edwin Southern developed a technique in which DNA sequences could be probed on a nylon membrane. That technique was called the Southern blot in honor to its creator. A couple years later, in 1977, a similar technique was developed, but this time to allow us to detect RNA on a membrane. And that technique was called the Northern blot. See a little trend coming up there? Yeah, you see what this is going. So since then, scientists decided that if I can see DNA on a membrane, I can see RNA on a membrane, why not proteins? And they started to try and develop that technique. In 1979, the first publication came out regarding detecting proteins on a membrane. However, the story is not that clear. There's still a lot of debate on who was the first person to publish a Western blot. And let me tell you that story. So again, in 1979, the first paper was out, and that paper was from George Stark's group in Stanford, California. And that was a fairly similar technique to what we now use. However, the transfer of the proteins from the gel onto the membrane was realized only through passive transfer. A couple months later, Harry Towbin's group from Switzerland developed the Western blot technique in a very similar way to what we now do in the labs, including the fact that proteins were transferred from the gel onto the membrane using an electric current. Then, in 1981, Neal Burnette's group from Seattle published the third paper relative to Western blotting. And what's interesting about that publication is that they had actually submitted it back in 1979 when the other publications were coming out. But the paper was denied, was rejected because of the simplicity of the technique. Now, what is important about this third publication is that that was the moment where Western blot actually received its name. They decided to call that technique Western blot in honor to the original scientist that developed the technique for DNA detection, Southern blot, and then the Northern blot, and now we finally have the Western blot. Not only that, but if you think about it, that group was from Seattle. So naming that technique the Western blot may have something else there. Now, like I said, there's still a lot of debate on who created the Western blot. And at the summary of this course, you have the link to the 3 papers so you can make your own decision. I will tell you that most people consider Towbin's publication to be the main one because the protocol is so similar to what we do nowadays. In that publication, they actually use an electric field to run or separate the natured proteins through an SDS page. After that step of separation, the proteins were transferred onto a nitrocellulose membrane, and primary antibodies were used to detect their protein of interest. The very last step was the use of labeled secondary antibodies to detect those proteins. Now, we're going to go through the details of the technique, of the science behind each step as we go through the next courses. But first, let's talk a little bit about the different applications for which we can use Western blots.